The night smelled of rain and rust as Leon stood beneath the flickering neon lights of the hospital street, his reflection bending and breaking on the wet pavement like something that could no longer hold itself together. The sky above him was dark, but not completely. There were thin cracks of silver light, slipping through the heavy clouds as if the universe itself was trying to breathe through the storm. Leon's coat was soaked, his hair stuck to his forehead, and every drop that hit his skin felt like a reminder that he was still here, still breathing, still waiting for something he could not name inside the hospital. The machines hummed softly behind the walls, a rhythm too steady, too calm for the chaos he felt inside his chest. He thought of the last time Mira had smiled, not the polite smile she gave to nurses or friends who visited, but the real one, the one that made her look like she was catching sunlight even in the middle of night. That smile had burned itself into him, like a scar, and he could still see it. Every time he blinked, she had always been strange, beautiful in a way that felt foreign to everything he knew. She used to call herself the alien princess, laughing as she said it, her voice light but full of meaning. Leon had never asked her why she said that. Maybe he was afraid to know, maybe deep down he already understood she never belonged to this world. He walked toward the hospital entrance, his steps echoing in the corridor like small heartbeats. The fluorescent lights buzzed above his head, and the sterile air smelled of metal and medicine. He felt the weight of his camera bag pressing against his side, an old habit. He carried it everywhere, even here, as if taking photos could somehow protect him from the truth inside the bag. There was a broken lens cracked during a storm when he tried to capture lightning over the sea. Mira had been there that night. She had laughed when the glass shattered, said maybe broken things see the world better. Leon had believed her then. Now, as he reached her room, his hands trembled. He stopped before the door, staring at the faint light seeping through the small window. He could hear her breathing, slow, uneven. He wanted to turn away, but his feet refused to move. It felt like every part of him was waiting for permission to fall apart. He pushed the door open quietly, and the world seemed to hold its breath. Mira lay on the bed, her skin pale, almost transparent, her hair scattered across the pillow like silver threads. She turned her head slightly, her eyes finding him instantly, and for a second it was like the stars had shifted to look back at him. Leon tried to speak, but his voice broke before sound could form. He stepped closer, each movement heavy as if the air itself had thickened around him. She smiled faintly, a ghost of that old fire in her eyes, and whispered something that did not reach his ears. He leaned in closer and caught it this time, a sound so fragile it barely existed. "She said you came back." Her words cracked, but her eyes glowed, and Leon felt something inside him shatter again. He nodded, unable to speak, just standing there in the quiet hum of machines' rain, still dripping from his coat as the alien princess smiled. Through her fading light, Mira had always called herself the alien princess, and Leon had once thought it was just another one of her strange poetic ways of escaping the ordinary. She had a habit of naming things that did not belong, naming feelings, moments, fragments of light, she said. It helped her remember that everything could mean something more. He had met her 3 years ago, when his camera still worked and his dreams still had structure. It was at an abandoned rooftop exhibition hosted by art students who believed the world could be rebuilt with paint and silence. The wind had been cold that night, and the city below had glowed like a sleeping creature. Mira had stood there barefoot, her silver hair catching every bit of light like a halo, and she was painting stars onto the side of a water tank using a brush that looked older than her. Hope Leon had watched her for a long time before he took a picture. The flash startled her. She turned around and smiled, the kind of smile that made the night feel alive again. He apologized, but she only laughed and said that cameras were just memory machines, and if he was going to steal her moment, he better make it look like forever. He had not known then that he would spend the rest of his life trying to do exactly that. They started talking in fragments at first, short conversations in between the wind and the hum of city noise. She told him she believed people were born from stardust and loneliness. He told her he believed in nothing, and she said that was still a kind of faith. Mira spoke about the universe like she had seen it up close, like she had danced in the gravity of dying suns. She made the world around her feel both enormous and fragile, and Leon found himself drawn to her orbit without even realizing when it began. He started visiting her rooftop every week. Sometimes she was painting, sometimes sculpting pieces from broken glass and rusted metal. She said beauty existed only where pain had lived first. Night she showed him a small metal charm shaped like a blade, dull and bent. She said it was her broken sword, and that every alien princess needed one because every fairy tale ended in battle. Leon laughed, but she did not. She said that every person fights something, and sometimes that something is themselves. He carried her words quietly. After that, like a secret, their friendship turned into something slower, deeper, not quite love, not quite peace. They spent nights chasing light through the city, streets capturing reflections of stars and puddles of rain. They talked about everything and nothing. He never told her how much she scared him, how much he needed her to keep existing. She made him feel like life could still be undone and rewritten, and that terrified him more than death now. Standing by her bed in that white, quiet room, he saw the same girl, the same alien princess, only smaller, thinner, softer, her skin glowing faintly under the hospital lights. He remembered her saying once that she was not from here, and maybe she had been right. Maybe she was only ever visiting this world, and he was just the one who got to see her before she went home. Asterisk. The storm had passed by morning, but the air still carried the scent of wet concrete, and cold metal. Leon sat by the hospital window, watching the city wake in slow motion, buses crawling through puddles, people wrapped in gray coats, moving like ghosts through fog. He felt the world outside continue without pause, while his own had stopped somewhere between heartbeat and silence. He had not slept. The chair beneath him, hard and cold, his fingers sore from gripping the broken charm that Mira once gave him, the dull blade pressing into his palm like a question that refused to fade. He looked at her sleeping, her breathing shallow yet steady, the sound faint but real, her hands thin and trembling resting over the blanket. The same hands that once painted constellations on walls and built sculptures out of rust and broken glass. Leon wanted to believe she would wake like she always did, stretch, smile, and tell him that life was a cruel joke worth laughing at. He wanted to believe that her voice would once again fill the air with strange beauty, that she would talk about galaxies and ghosts and how everything that dies still glows somewhere in the dark. He remembered the first time she had let him take her picture. Really take it, not stolen, not from a distance. She had stood against a backdrop of blue graffiti, a swirl of stars she had painted herself. Her hair had been wild, her eyes fierce. She told him to capture her before she disappeared. He asked where she was going. She just smiled and said nowhere, everywhere, the same thing. It had felt like she was trying to tell him something, but he had been too afraid to ask, then afraid of what her truth might sound like. He thought about the way she lived, with no care for what made sense. She once climbed a derelict tower just to photograph sunrise from a higher angle. When he shouted for her to come down, she laughed, said that falling would at least prove she tried to fly. He had never met anyone who touched danger with so much tenderness. He wanted to be like her, fearless and infinite, but he was only human, built of hesitation and quiet panic. The doctor came in, briefly checked her vitals, said little, left quietly. Leon did not ask questions. He did not want to hear words that made endings real. He stared at her face, trying to memorize every line, every freckle, every shadow. His camera sat unused beside him because some moments could not be captured, only carried. Mira stirred slightly, her eyes fluttering open. For a second she looked at him, confusion soft and slow, then recognition. She whispered his name, almost soundless. He leaned closer and she smiled faintly, saying, "You still look lost." Leon felt something heavy in his chest, like gravity shifting inside him. He wanted to answer, but no words formed. She closed her eyes again, drifting somewhere between dream and departure. He sat there until the light outside turned gold, the day moving forward without asking permission. He wondered if this was what she meant when she called herself an alien princess, that feeling of being alive in a world that did not belong to you, and yet still loving it like it was the only one. For Leon began to visit every day. The nurses stopped asking who he was. They could tell by the way he sat beside her bed hour after hour that he was not just another visitor. He was the one who waited, the one who refused to leave. Even when the halls grew empty and the lights dimmed at night, he would watch her sleep, tracing the slow rhythm of her breathing, counting each rise and fall as if it were a fragile secret he needed to protect. Sometimes she would wake in the early hours, her voice faint, asking if it was still raining outside, and he would tell her yes, even when it was not, because the sound of rain had always comforted her. He brought her pieces of the world she could no longer reach, photographs of the city, the reflection of moonlight on wet streets, the faces of strangers who did not know they were being remembered. She would look at each picture as if she could touch it, and said they all looked like fragments of dreams. He loved when she said things like that because she always made life sound bigger than it was. One afternoon, she asked him if he still carried his camera, and he nodded, showing it to her. She smiled and said, "Promise me you will take a picture of the world when I am gone so I can see it through your eyes." And he wanted to tell her not to talk like that, but her tone was so gentle, so certain, that he could not find the strength to interrupt her. Days slipped into weeks, and time became something that no longer followed rules. Leon lost count of how long he had been coming. Her condition wavered between fragile hope and quiet despair, but she never stopped smiling, never stopped asking him what beauty he had found that day. She made him believe that even in the middle of dying one could still create something worth remembering. He took her sketches and sculptures and began photographing them under different lights, each shot capturing a piece of her spirit, as if he was building a world that would hold her after she left one evening. As the sun began to fall, he found her sitting up on the bed for the first time in days, her eyes brighter than they had been in weeks. She said she wanted to go to the roof one last time. He hesitated, but her voice carried that same old spark, so he helped her walk slowly, carefully, through the empty hallways. The nurses looked away, pretending not to see. They reached the roof, and the city stretched before them, infinite and alive.
She took
A deep breath said, "It still smells like stars." Leon felt tears burn his throat, but he kept silent. She held out her hand and said, "Remember when we met here, you took a picture and called it forever. I want you to know forever is now." They stood together under the open sky, the wind lifting her hair, the horizon painted in orange and violet. She looked like she belonged. They're like a star returning home. He wanted to freeze that moment, but he did not raise his camera. Some things were too sacred to frame. He knew then that every heartbeat beside her was already a photograph that would never fade. The roof had felt endless that evening, the sky folding itself into shades of gold and violet, and Leon could not tell if time had slowed or if it had stopped altogether. Mira stood there leaning slightly on his shoulder, her breathing shallow but steady, her gaze fixed somewhere far beyond the city. She said, "The air feels like freedom," and he wanted to ask her to stay longer, to keep talking, to keep existing, but the words caught in his throat and turned into silence. She smiled as if she could hear the thoughts he was too afraid to say. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the small metal charm, the broken blade she had made years ago from melted scraps of streetlight. She turned it between her fingers, the surface catching the dying sun like a drop of fire. She said, "Every blade breaks eventually, but it does not stop being a weapon. It just changes what it can cut." And Leon did not understand what she meant until much later. She pressed the charm into his hand and told him to keep it safe, to remember that every broken thing still had the power to protect. She said it softly, her voice trembling like wind over glass. He closed his fingers around it, the edges cold against his skin, and promised, though he did not know what the promise meant. That night, after he took her back to the room, she was quiet more than usual, her eyes watching the ceiling as if she could see the stars through it. Leon sat beside her, unable to move, unable to sleep. He watched her until dawn, when the first light crept through the blinds, turning everything pale and new. She opened her eyes and whispered that she had dreamed of flying. She said it was not like a bird but like falling upward, until everything below her became small and kind and far away. Leon told her she would fly again one day, and she smiled, said, "Maybe I already have." Days passed and she began to fade faster, her voice thinner, her body lighter. The doctor spoke in words that did not sound like language anymore. Numbers, hours, possibilities. Leon tuned them out. He focused only on the sound of her breathing, on the faint pulse under her skin. He began to take pictures again, not of her face, but of the light in the room, the way it shifted with each hour, as if the world itself was recording her leaving. He filled rolls of film with silence, with memory, with love that did not know where to go. One afternoon she reached for his hand, and her touch was barely there. She said, "When I am gone, do not make me small, do not turn me into sadness, make me into something that moves, something that burns." Leon nodded, but the tears came anyway. She wiped them with the back of her hand, weak but gentle, and said, "You never understood. I was never asking you to save me, only to see me." He stayed with her as night returned, the room bathed in blue light, the broken blade resting beside her pillow, her eyes closing slowly as if the stars themselves were pulling her home. Leon sat still, the hum of machines fading into the sound of his own heartbeat, the promise of forever echoing through the quiet. The morning came soft and gray, and the world felt heavier than before. Leon woke in the chair beside her bed, his neck aching, his eyes dry. The machine beside her had stopped making the small rhythmic sound that had become the fragile heartbeat of every passing day. He looked at her, and for a moment he did not understand what silence meant. Her face was calm, her lips curved faintly, as if she was dreaming still. He reached out, touched her hand. It was cold, and yet he swore he could feel the echo of warmth fading beneath his skin. He whispered her name once, twice again, and the word hung in the air, then dissolved like mist into nothing. He sat there for a long time, not crying, not speaking, only breathing, because breathing was all that was left to do when everything else had ended. The nurse came in, said something he could not hear, placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, but he barely felt it, his eyes fixed on the shape of her hair across the pillow, on the faint shimmer of silver that still caught the morning light. She had always said that the universe loved symmetry, that everything ended where it began, and he thought, maybe she was right because she looked peaceful in a way she never had when she was alive. They took her away that afternoon. He followed quietly, holding the broken blade charm in his pocket, feeling its edges pressing into his palm, the weight of it grounding him in a world that suddenly felt too empty. Outside, the air was cold, sharp, carrying the faint smell of rain. He walked until his legs ached, until the city lights blurred into streaks of gold and blue. He reached the rooftop where they had first met, the place where she painted stars and promised forever. The wall was still there, faded now, cracked and peeling, but traces of her constellations remained, small fragments of her scattered across concrete. He set the camera on the ground, raised it slowly and took a picture of the wall, then another and another until his hands stopped shaking. He thought about what she had asked of him, not to make her small, not to turn her into sadness, and he realized that every picture, every memory, every breath was a way of keeping her alive. He whispered her name. Again, softer this time, as if saying it could guide her somewhere beyond the clouds above. The sky. Night fell and the city below pulsed with light. He closed his eyes and imagined her there among the stars, laughing, calling him foolish, the alien princess returning to her home. He smiled through the ache, through the hollow that had replaced his chest, and for the first time in weeks, he felt the faint flicker of warmth inside him, like starlight refusing to fade. When he finally opened his eyes, he lifted the camera one last time, aimed it toward the heavens, and pressed the shutter. The sound, small but final, a whisper between worlds. He looked at the picture on the display. Only darkness and light, colliding, endless, infinite, he thought. She would have liked that. He thought maybe that was what she meant all along. Weeks drifted into months, and Leon moved through the world like a shadow, learning again how to exist in the silence she had left behind. He stopped visiting the hospital, but every night he found himself on the same rooftop, staring at the city below, listening to the hum of engines and the faint cry of wind between the buildings. The broken blade charm never left his pocket. He carried it like a heartbeat, like an unspoken vow. He began taking photographs again, not of people but of places, abandoned factories, quiet stairwells, forgotten corners of the city where light slipped through cracks in concrete. He said he was searching for her, but deep down he knew he was searching for himself. He developed the photos in a small dark room beneath his apartment, the smell of chemicals sharp and familiar, each image slowly blooming under the red light, like memory rising from the depths. He saw her in everything, in the glint of metal and puddles after rain, in the dust motes that danced through slivers of sunlight. Sometimes he would whisper to the empty room, telling her what he had seen that day, as if she were standing beside him, paint on her fingers and laughter in her voice. He started to understand what she had meant when she told him to claim her, not to end her, not to let her vanish into grief, but to carry her in the things he created. One night, as he developed a new roll of film, he found a photo he did not remember taking. It showed the rooftop drenched in golden light, and in the far corner a faint figure, blurred, almost invisible, her outline glowing faintly like the echo of a star. He stared at it for hours, trying to convince himself it was a trick of exposure, but part of him knew better. He smiled through tears, whispered, "I see you," and for a moment the room felt warm again. His work began to change. Galleries started noticing the rawness, the stillness in his photographs. They said his art carried the silence of loss and the beauty of what remains. He never explained. He only said that every picture was a conversation between light and memory. He titled his first exhibition, "Forever Is Now," and when people asked what it meant, he said it was something someone once taught him. At the opening, he walked among the visitors, listening to their murmurs, feeling their eyes on the wall, each image pulsing with fragments of her. He stopped before the photograph of the blurred rooftop figure and whispered softly, "Thank you," because without her there would have been nothing to Solitaire that night. When the gallery emptied, he stood alone under the spotlights, the broken blade charm cold in his hand. He lifted it toward the ceiling, where faint dust shimmered in the beams of light. He thought of her voice, the way she had said, "End me" or "Claim me," and realized he had finally understood. To claim her was to live fully, to let her exist in the beauty he built, to turn grief into creation. He closed his eyes, breathed in the silence, and for the first time felt whole again. The exhibition had ended, but the echoes of that night stayed with Leon long after the last light had faded from the gallery. He spent his days wandering through the city, camera always in hand, capturing moments that most people walked past without seeing: the reflection of a street lamp in a puddle, the curve of a shadow against a rusted wall, a single flower growing through a crack in stone. Everything felt alive in a way it never had before, as if the world had finally decided to show him the language Mira had always spoken. He began to travel beyond the city, following whispers of light across oceans and mountains, seeking new skies that could remind him of Heron, a quiet coastal town. He found an old lighthouse, standing alone against the horizon, its walls peeling its windows, clouded with salt and time. He climbed the spiral staircase to the top and set his camera down. The wind was fierce, the sea below crashing like the pulse of something ancient. He closed his eyes and imagined her, there beside him, hair, silver eyes, endless voice, soft as the tide. She had always said she belonged to the stars, but maybe she had belonged to the sea too. He raised his camera and took a single shot, the frame filled with the horizon where light met water. It felt like a doorway to somewhere else. When he returned home, he printed the photograph and placed it beside the image of the blurred rooftop figure. Together they looked like a conversation between heaven and earth. He could almost hear her voice in the stillness saying, "See, Leon, this is what forever looks like." He smiled and whispered, "Yes, I see it now," and the silence around him felt full of her presences. Months passed. People began to write about his work, calling it celestial realism, saying that he captured emotion in form of light. He never cared for the praise. What mattered was that through every image, she continued to speak. Through every shadow she breathed. He started a series called The Alien Princess, a collection of 9 photographs, each one a piece of her story. The final image remained unfinished. He wanted it to be perfect, but perfection was something she never believed in. She used to say, "Beauty lives in what is broken," and maybe he was afraid of breaking her one last time. On the anniversary of her death, he returned to the rooftop, the same cracked wall, the same faded stars. Though time had dimmed them, their shape still remained. He carried a small lantern filled with her sketches folded gently inside. He lit the flame and watched the paper curl, the light rising slowly into the night. The wind carried the ashes across the sky, scattering them among the city lights. He lifted his camera, captured that fleeting moment, and felt peace settle into him like dawn after endless rain. As he looked at the image glowing on his screen, he whispered softly, "You are everywhere now," and the night seemed to answer with the quiet hum of the universe breathing around him. Paused and the world changed, but Leon continued to move through it with his camera and his quiet heart. The alien princess had become legend in his art. People spoke of her as if she were a myth, a muse, a spirit who lived inside the light of his work. His exhibitions traveled from city to city, and every gallery that hung his photographs felt like a temple built in her memory. He never corrected those who asked if she was real. He only said she was someone who taught him that love was the language of Xinyi. Grew older lines forming around his eyes like small maps of all the places he had carried her. Through his hair grayed and his hands shook slightly when he held his camera, but the lens still found the beauty in everything it touched. He began teaching students how to see light, how to capture emotion, not in faces but in the spaces between them. He told them that photography was not about what you look at but how you love what you see. And when they asked him why he spoke as if light were alive, he smiled and said, "Because it is." Every night he returned to his apartment, walls covered with prints from decades of work. Some framed, some scattered across the floor. His favorite remained the first one of her, the rooftop. Under a swirl of painted stars, her face half turned or smiled like something caught between worlds. He would sit before it for hours, listening to the hum of the city outside, and sometimes he thought he could hear her laugh, carried through the wind like a secret echo. One winter evening, the air sharp with cold, he walked to the same rooftop, camera hanging from his neck, the city lights below glowing like constellations. He stood where she once stood, feeling the familiar ache in his chest. He whispered her name and waited. The silence answered, but it was not empty. It was full of the same warmth that had followed him all these years. He closed his eyes, imagined her there beside him. The alien princess returned, not as a ghost but as light surrounding him, wrapping him in stillness. He lifted the camera one last time, pointed it toward the horizon where the first hint of dawn was breaking. The lens caught the glow of morning, the faint shimmer of frost on the railing, the promise of another day. He pressed the shutter and felt a strange calm settle over him, like the world had exhaled through him. The image developed later showed nothing but light, endless, pure and soft. No shapes, no shadows, only radiance. He titled it Home. When he passed away quietly in his sleep, months later, they found the broken blade charm resting on his desk beside that final photograph, and a small note written in his uneven handwriting. It said, "She was never from this world, and neither was the love she gave me, but she taught me how to live inside the light, and in the end, that is all forever really means."